Welcome, everyone. Sorry about the late start. I would be doing Cameroonians a disservice if I said I was on Cameroonian time, but it's kind of true. My name's Eliza Anyangwe. I am the managing editor of CNN as Equals, which is CNN's gender inequality reporting team. If you speak to any of the folks on our team, we will probably describe our work as reporting on the winners and losers of patriarchy as opposed to telling stories about women specifically. It is so wonderful to see you all here. This is exact copy and paste of the session we ran last year. And we did it because there are always so many stories that we wish to highlight, not just in our own newsroom, but from across the world, focusing on gender reporting and all the various issues that affect, 50% of the world's population. I'll move on to the other slide. You can find out a little bit of what we do through that QR code. The format is a little high tension because it's Pechakucha style, which for those of you who don't know, it means basically a bunch of visual-only slides that the speakers will use as their prompts to talk to you about their work. The name of the session is How I Broke the Story and sharing best practice in gender reporting. So each speaker will take a single story or a project that they have worked on from a huge range of newsrooms and media projects around the world, both big and small, and they will tell you what the project was, what they did, how they did it, what they learned, and we will try as much as possible to have questions from the floor. We are very grateful to the Perugia organizers because, as you will know, sessions are usually 50 minutes, and we have an hour because we have so many people. I have probably burnt that hour turning up 10 minutes late, but such is life. So we're gonna do what we can in the time that we have. I should get my phone out. So it's not gonna be set to automatically scroll because it's not that deep. I will be the finger pressing through, which is probably more annoying. But so speakers, if I move too quickly through your slides or not, I will set the 6.5 minutes for each of you. So that is the amount of time that you have to talk us through your project. So it's rapid fire rounds, learning about a range of stories in a range of places. All right, let's get started. Oh, hold on. Oh, now the GIF works. Isn't it pretty? Okay, let's move on through the loop. Bueno. All right, over to our first speaker, Megan Clement.
This slide looks like I am deporting Syrian women from Denmark.
Best practice in deporting Syrian women from Denmark. Here we go. Get your notebooks out.
I promise you I don't have that kind of power. Okay, so I'm going to talk about a story that I worked on with a coalition of news organizations, including Lighthouse Reports, New Lines Magazine, Daraj Media, and the Impact Newsletter, which I edit. So we found that Denmark's notoriously harsh asylum policy was disproportionately affecting Syrian women asylum seekers, many of whom were survivors of domestic violence. So the story begins in 2015 when large numbers of Syrians arrived in Europe fleeing the civil war there. Denmark and much of Scandinavia initially was quite welcoming to these refugees, but in 2019, the Danish government declared that Damascus was safe for return. This meant that people who were on temporary protection visas, which is something that Denmark is only able to do because it has an opt-out from the EU's migration policy, were being handed notices that their residency permits had been revoked. And when we began to look into this, we found that this was something that was disproportionately affecting women, and the women that we spoke to were highly likely to be survivors of domestic violence. And what we found, next slide please, as a consequence of this policy that found that Damascus was safe, which was obviously something that was not agreed to by human rights groups and indeed the UN. However, this was a decision that was made. We found that authorities either did not believe the women whose permits they were revoking when they said that they were at risk of domestic violence if they returned to Syria, or they did not find domestic violence to be a valid reason for refugee protection. On the other hand, men who were between the ages of 18 and 42 were given automatic protection permanently because they risked military conscription when they returned to Syria. Military conscription is considered in the Refugee Convention. Domestic violence is not. So, finally, yes, I'm missing a slide, it's fine. Denmark does not have diplomatic relations with Syria, so the women affected were not being threatened with immediate deportation to Syria, but they were being threatened with being sent to remote detention camps, deportation camps, to await such time as relations were normalized. So how did we tell this story? Next slide, please. We first looked at this category of protection visa. This is called a 7-3, and this is the weakest form of refugee protection that you can get in Denmark. This means that it is the most easy to revoke this type of refugee protection. We requested the data from the Danish Immigration Service, and as you can see here, we found that 64% of people on this visas were women. So when it came to revoking these women, we saw that women were disproportionately affected. We then looked at the permits that had actually been withdrawn, and you can see in the figures here, in 2019, very few permits withdrawn, 10 women, 6 men. And then after this decision that Damascus and subsequently other parts of Syria were safe, we see the numbers increasing, and again, women being disproportionately represented. So, Eliza asked me to talk about what challenges we encountered. Just on a source level, the women we were talking to and the sources for the story were people who had been heavily traumatized, not just by one of the most horrific civil conflicts of our time, but by the violence of their partners, whether back in Syria or in Denmark. The conversations we had with them took literally years to build trust. And indeed, one source had to drop out of the process because she could not bear to go through the fact-checking process with external media. So while she trusted the reporter on our team, she was not comfortable talking about her story to the fact-checkers. And so we obviously allowed her to take a step away, and we had to re-report that part of the story. So it took a while. You can just... That is my last slide. Okay. Yep. So... One more. Yeah, okay, this is a deportation camp, so this is where they were being threatened to be sent to. So we thought this might be a relatively straightforward story to report because Denmark is a relatively open country with strong press freedom. But the challenges were finding outlets to join us in this investigation, to do the kind of complex long-term reporting and accompanying sources through what was a very difficult process. In terms of the impact, the story gave voice to Syrian women in a country that is becoming ever more hostile to refugees. And it was important to me because I'm a feminist journalist, I work in gender equality a lot, and we often hold up the Scandinavian countries as kind of bastions of gender equality that come at the top at various indexes. But if you take an intersectional analysis, you can see how a harsh refugee policy like this can create an environment where it's really the most vulnerable women in the country who are being uniquely harmed. Clear tips for how this work can inspire others, which is my last little bit. I would just say that there is always a gender angle, but sometimes even governments don't see it because we are often dealing with institutions and policies that are written by men in a world that imagines the male as default. When the 1951 Refugee Convention was signed, it was signed by overwhelmingly men. I've had a look at the picture. I think I can find 2 women in there. So that was a convention that was written by and for men that understands an asylum seeker as facing particularly gendered risks, and that does not account for the kind of experiences of the women that we spoke to this story, who were nonetheless people in great need of protection. So always look for the gender angle and always ask for gender disaggregated data, which is just simply data broken down by gender. That's it.
With a full 45 seconds spare, Megan, you have, yes, doing it for feminist journalism. All right, next up, Vanessa Offiong talking about a story you reported for As Equals.
Okay. So this story basically looked at queer women and what their experiences were like finding love online. This was a story that was part of our series as Equals on systems error, which looked at women's experiences online across board. But I chose to look at queer women in Nigeria and what that experience was like for them. Being a queer woman in Nigeria is hard enough, and for a lot of them, the online space is what is supposed to provide them some level of safety in terms of their social life, in terms of their love life, and other things that concern them. But the online space was posing a serious threat that was not only limited to their online lives, but was being manifested in the physical as well. these women were being attacked by people, these women were experiencing homophobic attacks online from not just strangers, but also family members who were monitoring them, who were getting people to track them, who were then luring them home to physically assault them, lock them up, organize rapes, and they were not getting any kind of protection. Nigeria has an online computer misuse act which should protect women. I mean, it's supposed to protect every citizen, but there seemed to be an exception for women who were in the LGBTQ plus community. A lot of them were looking for relationships on different online platforms, from Tinder to Facebook to Instagram. And even in cases where they had taken precautions to first meet these people they were planning on having relationships with, so they had done video calls and all of that. When they agreed to physical meetings, this turned out to be exploitation. In some cases, they were raped. One of the main characters for this story is somebody who was raped by two men in a house of some lady who was supposed to be her lover, but the lady had set her up in the kind of attack that is called keto in Nigeria. So it's basically catfishing. These two men raped her. She got pregnant, and she has a 15-year-old daughter who's a constant reminder of that experience. Her parents, when they found out how she got pregnant, sent her off to church, which was supposed to be some kind of protection for her. But then even the pastors in the church were trying to exploit her, and she had to run away from there. We spoke to about 18 women who had had these different kinds of experiences, who were also willing to talk about their stories, because it took us over a year to gain their trust enough to be able to share the experiences that they had. Some of them who had to marry to cover, as a disguise for their sexuality, and being forced by mothers especially, were living in marriages under duress because their husbands had found out about their sexualities and they were being threatened. This, please go back to that slide. This image here is an illustration of a young girl whose mother found out she was lesbian and sent her to a Quranic school where her feet were bound in chains like this. She was in these chains for 6 months. She was beaten. Other women who were in that Quranic school as a result of their sexuality, some were raped. She eventually was freed and then had to go into a relationship with a man because her mother wanted her to have children. And that man ended up exploiting her because he knew of her sexuality and was going to expose her, became violent with her, and eventually she had to move out of that relationship, and she was back on the streets. You can go on to the next slide. So we also found out that the military, the authorities that should protect these women, were part of the exploitation chain. This is a picture of, this picture illustrates one of the women's experiences where she had been chatting with a woman. She had been exploited. She had first been ketoed and dared to go back online after a few years to find love. And the second time, after agreeing to meet with a woman physically in a public space, a man ensouled in a military uniform shows up, asks her to undress, and then leaves her there, humiliated. The law really is very culpable. That was something that was very shocking for me, to see the imbalance in terms of what the law protects. One of the women who dared to report that she had been raped, the police said she was wayward. That is because she opened her legs for the men. That's why they raped her. So there was no protection whatsoever for her. Alozie, I've used pseudonyms for these women. Alozie is somebody whose husband was suspicious of her online activities and actually followed her on Tinder and found out that she was in a relationship with a woman, set her up with his colleague who molested her physically, and the man came and took pictures of her. Her husband also came, did videos, and threatened to expose those to national radio stations. A lot of this we found out was happening in Lagos. And why Lagos? Because Lagos is quite a big city in Nigeria, so it provided some kind of safe haven for these women. but it's really not safe for them. Yeah. Okay. Okay. These were organizations that we worked with that helped with the story. Keto Alert. This is something I also learned, that the men were providing security and exposing people who were catfishing them online, but women were not doing the same. And it's because even men in the gay community were attacking women in the community as well. So it was safer for the men to provide their own security, but not as much for the women. These are other organizations that are providing security. Pride TV, which is Women's Health and Equal Rights, that we're providing therapy for a lot of these women in different parts of Nigeria. How would you like to conclude? It's still, so for a lot of these women, this was the first time they were talking about these experiences that they had shared. And it was very important that we were listening to their stories without any prejudices. We were respecting the fact that they didn't want their names shown or their faces shown. They wanted to be spoken to in certain areas. We were willing to go that extra mile to give them that kind of comfort, to be able to share, and also point them to these organizations, because a lot of them did not know they could get help. So we're able to point them in the direction of these organizations. So I think that for me was a big plus. And sorry, just before I came, I saw that the IG of police was saying that cross-dressing is not a crime, because Nigeria has a same-sex, and it was nice to see that a police ranking that high in the country was acknowledging that cross-dressing is not a crime in the country, for which a lot of these people had been attacked, on the streets. So I think that was a good one for me.
Ladies and gentlemen, Vanessa, thank you. So I will tell you that Vanessa arrived from Lagos with treats for the CNN team, and I should have known when I was eating her chin-chin that she was hoping to buy herself extra time on the panel. Now I am complicit. John-Allan Kenyans have no such excuse. So over to you, please, for your session.
All right. Good evening, everybody. I think many of you in the audience will know that for centuries, women have been silenced in various ways, but none of these ways have been as brutal or as final as femicide. So this project, this reporting project, was a collaboration between Africa Uncensored, Africa Data Hub based in South Africa, and Odipodev based in Nairobi. So we can go to the first slide. I'd like to introduce you to Naneo Muthoni. She is a regular Kenyan, a daughter, a sister, a girlfriend, a lover, and an artist. You can go to the next slide. She was laid to rest on the 22nd of November, 2022. I covered the funeral, and this is one of the many photos that I took, and I went back to her crime scene. The first photograph you see is a long shot of her bedsitter with her boyfriend and her lived. The marks that you see obviously are blood where he bludgeoned her. And the last two photographs are where she made her last stand before she was killed and her boyfriend ran off. But something bothered me about Naneo's murder. Because I've covered so many of these kinds of stories, I was starting to build an anecdotal thread about what was happening, trends. But it was very misty. It was very difficult to read exactly what was happening. So it turned out that Africa Data Hub, as well as Odipodev, were facing the same problem. There was a dearth in reporting about these kinds of cases. And so we had one mission. We were going to put together a live data set of these kinds of crimes and figure that out.
Is this your, yeah? Oh, I was like, where is this audio coming from?
In Kenya. So our data dates back all the way to 2016 to date. And basically what we're going to do is put together a living database on, the femicide situation in Kenya to bring this to light, which is what we're launching on Friday, right?
So that's really the simple mission. We wanted to try and figure out exactly what was happening. And it helped us debunk many myths. For example, I'm sure a number of you have heard of these excuses that would be given by various men. She deserved it. She dressed badly. Very, very many different excuses for why women would be killed. But our data started to debunk that. For instance, one of those myths was that most people who are killed in these situations are single women, but 80% of the women who were killed in cases of femicide were either wives or girlfriends. The data set showed that from 2016, 500 women in Kenya had been killed, and this is up to January of 2024. The other slide shows that the average number of days that it takes for a case to go from prosecution to conviction, 1,858 days or 5 years. Can press play?
Yeah. Oh, hold on.
Sorry.
I learned through the social media. When it happened, I didn't know. I was so shocked. She was ever complaining, having a back and forth argument with the guy, crying. Every time Wangeshi tried to walk out on him, he wouldn't let her.
I just feel like her life was wasted by somebody who said he loved her, but it was not real.
I'd been told she had been killed by being knifed. From seeing the body, I ruled it out. I noted some marks on her throat.
Killing her was killing me.
So Purity Wangeshi, whose story you just saw, typifies cases of femicide. There is a trend. There'd be physical abuse, mental abuse. The physical abuse would ratchet up, and finally it would wind up in murder. When this data set was launched a few days later, based on a number of other cases that had taken place in Kenya in January of this year, over 10,000 women took to the streets marching, demanding accountability for crimes of femicide. And this happened across the country. Many of the women were wearing T-shirts bearing data from our data set and placards that were talking about the exact same things that we had talked about in our data set. So this is what we've learned. These are parts of the answers, obviously. There's no one answer. The first thing is, obviously, gather data. Try and get as much data as you can, because it will help nuance the storytelling that you will then do as a journalist. Then, when collaborating with different people who want to either support your stories, tell them about the people within those data sets, and not just present projects, because that then becomes a stronger case. And finally, because the data set is a public data set, it's available to many other journalists for various other forms of storytelling. So that's a long-term solution. What's next? We want to deepen this data set and take it to different countries. South Africa, for instance, as well as Nigeria, have problems with femicide. We want to, do more global storytelling, as well as partner with various other organizations. I'd like to loan the last few minutes. Oh, okay.
Few minutes?
Oh, sorry. So that's my last slide. I had one last video to share of the number of women who had been killed in Kenya since 2016, but given that we have constraints of time, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Such powerful work. Thank you so much, John-Allan. Okay, and just before the bell. All right, Mia, over to you. Oh, wait, that's the title slide?
You can start on that one, yeah.
Okay.
Is this on?
Yes, it should be.
Okay. So our project is about how to regulate sex work in the safest way possible. And what does evidence tell us about how to do that? And now we have about roughly 180,000 sex workers in South Africa. And where gender comes in is that 9 out of 10 of them are women, and about 4% are transgender sex workers. The next one. So this is a picture of sex workers protesting for their rights in South Africa, and why we as a health journalism organization are interested in sex worker regulation is because of the impact of regulation on the spread of disease and on gender-based violence. Next slide. So right now, sex work is illegal in South Africa, and we based our reporting on a large body of research which shows that if you criminalize sexuality or gender or a profession such as sex work, you spread disease because you make it hard for people to access health facilities because they fear arrest. Next slide. So in South Africa, we see the consequences of criminalization of sex work very clearly playing out. In many sex worker communities, about 8 out of 10 sex workers are infected with HIV, and there's a very high rate of gender-based violence among sex workers because they're unable to report violent customers to the police, and very often the abusers of them is the police themselves. We started off our reporting by making research really easy to understand about the matter. So we produced 2-minute videos like this one, in which we highlighted things like the fact that making sex work illegal doesn't reduce the number of sex workers in a country. It merely drives the profession underground, making it hard to regulate. Please stay on that slide, Eliza. So we also humanized sex works. This is Nosipu Vedima. She's from Durban. She has been forced by police to have sex with them multiple times. In other words, she's been raped by them. And we published her story along with the results of studies on the impact of criminalization on violence. Next slide. We also told the stories of Cleopatra, Netta, and Jennifer from Cape Town. They lived under this bridge and they were trans women sex workers, but they all have since died, either from HIV or by violence. And they supported each of them between 3 and 9 people with their income. Next slide. Because a proportion of, sorry, this the previous one, Eliza. Oh no, you can go to the next one, that's fine. So contradiction is a really strong news value and it attracts readers. So we use that in our sex worker stories to contrast South Africa with countries where sex work is legal. We published a long form story which compared the life of an Amsterdam sex worker, Elsa, with that of Nosipu, the South African sex worker I referred to. Now, often reporting alone isn't enough to get policymakers to change their minds. So you often need to get sex workers and policymakers into one room to fight it out. So that's why we organized a discussion forum in which we got sex workers to interact with our Deputy Justice Minister, who at the time opposed the decriminalization of sex work very harshly. We also wanted people like our Deputy Justice Minister to see what regulated facilities look like inside and how different that is from the facilities in South Africa. So we describe these things in our stories, and in this picture you can see on your right hand probably there's something up against the wall, and those are rules for clients in Amsterdam facility where they, for instance, told that they're not allowed to ask for unprotected sex. We also wanted to reach, even though our main audience is decision makers, we wanted to reach as broad as possible an audience. So we also produced podcasts. And on that picture is a woman from Amsterdam who used to be a sex worker. She's now a sex worker activist. And it's a daughter who sits with her. And we did an interview with them on how it impacted their relationship that the mother was a sex worker. And interestingly enough, not very badly. Not a bad relationship at all. We also cut video clips. Oh, there's our Deputy Health Minister, John Jeffrey, sitting there. He is talking to one of his former harshest enemies, a sex worker activist, on our television program. And in December, our government announced a bill which will decriminalize sex work. And one of the main reasons that happened is because a sex worker who attended our public discussion forum convinced him to change his mind. And that's why you could sit there with Vanessa Offiong. Next slide.
I think that's your last one.
My goodness, I had more slides on my side.
Oh no, I have failed you as your moderator.
Is there time left to talk?
You do, you have 15 seconds.
So one of the challenges we experienced is, of course, judgment and prejudice, because policymakers have opinions about the morality of sex work. So one of the things we had to try to do in our reporting is to convince policymakers that you don't have to support sex work in order to support decriminalization, because it would be better for everyone if the profession is done and regulated in a safe way. And lessons to end with that we learned was that interviewees can change their minds. Along the way, our Amsterdam sex worker gave us full permission for her pictures and changed her mind. Afterwards, we couldn't use a face, we had to change that. And then to take the morals out of sex work when you come to report on regulation. And lastly, consistency and empathy are the currencies of trust. If you continue not to sensationalize things and you have empathy with sex workers and realize that these stories have impacts on their lives, they start to trust you and you get more access and can tell more human stories.
All right, over to our last speaker, Ankur.
Hi everyone, so I'm editing can you hear me? Yeah, okay. I'm editing a series of stories called Beyond the Binary for CNN as Equals. So this is a set of 5 stories. Each uniquely looks at how trans, intersex, and non-binary people live their lives, and they're often complex interactions with broader systems like healthcare, housing, police, public spaces. I'd be talking about 2 of those stories, which are already out. Next slide, please. In this story, we looked at the crushing burden of living with gender dysphoria and the risks some trans people are willing to take in order to match their anatomy with their gender identity. We followed Bianca Balala, a trans woman from rural Philippines, who couldn't afford vaginoplasty in her own country, so she found a really cheap clinic in Bangkok. While most clinics charged between $7,000 to $15,000 US in Asia, this particular clinic offered the surgery in just about $2,000. Next slide, please. Given the surgery is so cheap, there were mixed reviews about the clinic. Some of her friends told her that the experience was good. Some complained of post-surgery complications, which can be quite fatal, and the stay at the clinic was just quite uncomfortable. But Balala decided to take the risk anyway because the other option was to continue to live with the body she didn't want. This is the doctor who runs the clinic. When we were starting to do research on the story, we found there were actually a lot of stories written about the clinic, but most of them presented Dr. Thep as a hero, helping the transgender community by providing the cheap surgery. Stories didn't quite look into how he was able to bring the cost so down. And when we started looking into that, we found that he was making certain choices which are not very popular in the medical fraternity. And which could potentially put people at risk. For example, he uses local anesthesia instead of a general one, which is general anesthesia is a much popular choice amongst the surgeons because they want to keep in mind the patient's safety. They don't feel pain during the surgery procedure, but he didn't want to hire an anesthesiologist because that would add to the cost. Just the facilities and the equipment he used at the clinic were very basic and sometimes even very rudimentary. For example, he would use a wooden plank to tie the hands of the patients while the surgery is on instead of using a modern table with arm extensions. All of this made the stay and post-recovery quite uncomfortable for patients. Even Bianca complained of a really stressful time during the surgery and afterward. But next slide, please. But she went back to Philippines, recovered well. Thankfully, the discomfort was behind her. And despite the complications she faced, she actually said that she would recommend trans women like her who come from lower socioeconomic background to go to Dr. Thep. There were 2 important points that this story made. One is to make the gender affirmation surgery really accessible and cheap so that people like Bianca don't have to go through this kind of experience and offer medical insurance, which is not a case in many Asian countries. The second is to complicate the narrative. Most of the stories earlier just presented Dr. Thep as a hero, and they would fall into the binaries of hero and victim narratives. But this one sort of complicated the narratives, and we had more to tell about the clinic. The second story we published looks at the rising anti-LGBTQ political and religious rhetoric in Kenya, which is rising across the world and is making societies unsafe for gender and sexual minorities, forcing them to constantly negotiate for their survival. And in Kenya, it's kind of manifesting in a way of a rampant culture of bribing. Multiple trans and intersex people told us that the authorities, like the police, would arrest them on fake charges, keep them in lockup for days until they paid them a bribe, and they would openly ask for it. Doctors would deny or delay treatment until they're offered tea. It's a slang for asking for bribe. Landlords would expect $100 extra every month as rent if they were to give their place to LGBTQ community. Housing agents told us that landlords specifically ask them to bring LGBTQ clients so that they can charge more, and brokers are even offered a cut on an LGBTQ client. So it's almost like a tax that queer people have to pay to live in Kenya. Next slide, please. Now it's a shared knowledge in the LGBTQ community that it's probably better to pay the bribe, and some even would save for it. And now they sort of even talk about how much money to pay which doctor in which particular hospital, and that's how they are living. There were several challenges that we faced while putting together this series. The first one is about the safety of the sources, and one of the decisions that we were constantly making during our reporting editing process was whether or not to interview the accused, and who are often the people in the position of power. For example, the landlords who were charging higher rents, or camp leaders in another story that's going to come out, who are harassing trans and intersex people in one of the largest refugee camps in the world. So we decided not to interview them because that could have direct consequence on the victims, and instead interview higher authorities, for example, governments or housing societies that are setting rules and standards. Another challenge was finding LGBTQ reporters in the local South who are skilled in telling these stories, because we wanted to ensure that the tellers of these stories are from the community. They're able to build trust, speak from their lived experience, ask deeper questions. But we found it was hard to find queer reporters in the global South. And when we did find, they didn't have a lot of training in working on investigations or deeper reporting, which highlights the need for creating more training opportunities for queer reporters in the global South. Lack of data was another big challenge in most parts of the global South. Like my colleague also mentioned, there is no data, and LGBTQ people are invisible in the larger data sets that are that researchers, governments, and humanitarian agencies are creating. We really have no understanding of their interactions with healthcare, public transport, what's happening in natural disasters like flooding, how older queer people are living. There is very little understanding. So what we did is that we just interviewed a lot of people to find patterns, but there's a massive lack of data. Maybe we need to build online repositories that my colleague said earlier. A couple of learnings from the project. One is that go above and beyond in explaining harm to your sources, because a lot of them are from vulnerable communities and don't really understand what it would mean if their stories come on a platform like CNN. What we did is that we told them multiple scenarios. For example, a shorter video could be cut from a larger clip. It could float in WhatsApp groups, or a local media could reproduce them. And what would that mean? So then they were sort of constantly making decisions that whether we want to go ahead with the consent or not. So just saying that whether you consent for the interview or not is not enough. You really have to go above and beyond in explaining harm. The last point is just focus on intersectional voices. LGBTQ community is not a monolith, and some communities within the community hold more privilege. For example, lower caste people, indigenous communities, queer refugees just have vastly different experiences than people from the privileged queer, and highlighting their experience is really important because it changes the narrative.
Thank you so very much to our speakers. I wonder if I see because, of course, the program is packed with many, many fantastic events. And I want to, we have a box essentially here of zines that we produced with tips on gender reporting. I made a very silly decision bringing them in with me because people leave that way. Tomiwa, I'm looking at you. Do you mind coming to, please give Tomiwa a round of applause. Oh, bless your heart. There you go. Paying the tax for being a big, strong man. There you go. Okay. Okay, so we now have 15 minutes. I have no questions for the audience. Well, for our speakers, I do, but the other challenge with so little time and so many of you is that you all have things that I'm sure you want to ask. So let's just get straight to the floor. Is there a roving mic? No, there isn't. Okay, that's fine. We can all project. It is a cozy room and the lights have just been turned down to make it even cozier. So if anyone has any questions, please raise your hands. Wonderful, let's just start from here. If you can make your questions as brief as possible, then we can take as many of them as possible. Do you want to start at the front? Oh, there is a mic. Alhamdulillah.
Alhamdulillah. Hello, my name is Osman Ahmed. I'm a journalist, producer from London. Can you guys hear me?
Now we can.
All good? I'm part of We Are Black Journos. Yeah, we literally just came from London today.
En masse.
En masse.
Yeah, rolling deep.
I've got a question for, is it Megan? Yeah. So with regards to the work that you did in Denmark, how closely did you have to make sure that you were kind of liaising with like caseworkers? Because I know that when it comes to like the whole refugee integration and migration of refugees that come in, there's a specific like timeline of like milestones that they have to achieve within like the first 2 to 3 months. Like for example, like language sort of specifications in terms of how they're going along with finding work. So what was the process of that like, and how strenuous was it to make sure that you know, they were kind of operating in line with what the laws that protected these refugees were?
Do you want to take more than one? Or do you want to?
What do you think? I think maybe we should, then we can, oh no, let's do one at a time, then you can.
Okay, sorry, are you asking how we made sure the caseworkers were doing their jobs, or?
Yeah, it's like essentially because it's a very rigid process from
Yeah.
what the caseworkers have to do. So how did that kind of not work, and for them to kind of like not be able to remain in the country, basically?
Yeah, how did it not work? Let me count the ways. We spent a lot of time speaking to caseworkers and lawyers who were representing the women involved. It's slightly complicated because when these women came to Syria, it was 2015, 2016, and they went through this whole asylum process, got put on this temporary visa, and then the decision. So they'd actually been through the process already, and they were more working with lawyers to appeal the decision to withdraw their permits. And the biggest problem was coming in the interviews they were doing with immigration officials, where they go and state their case, right? It's an incredibly intimidating situation where you're having to share extremely personal, extremely distressing information with essentially people who present as police and Syrian women asylum seekers have lots of reasons not to trust the police in Denmark and lots of reasons not to trust the police in Syria. So that was already very difficult, but there was a simple thing. I mean, one of the lawyers said to me, it's like, this is how it is in Denmark. They don't believe the women. And it was that simple. One of the women had videos, and I've watched these videos and they're awful, of her ex-husband, who was a member of a militia in Syria, waving a gun around and saying, haha, Denmark's going to deport you. When you get back, I'm going to kill you. And the immigration authorities said, you have arranged for him to do that to try and stay in Syria. So when we, in Denmark. So I mean, if you've reported on gender-based violence, it's like every tactic of gaslighting and ignoring was being perpetrated by the state here. So it was really less the caseworkers because the asylum process had been done, and more the authorities, and getting these authorities to actually believe these women, even in extraordinary cases like that when you've got documentary evidence.
We take the question just behind you.
Hello guys, my name is Jamel. I'm from We Are Black Journalists as well. I'm currently doing a report on femicide in London, and I'm finding it hard to, approach the families of the bereaved to get them to talk and speak about, their daughters, sisters, mothers who have died due to femicide. So I was just wondering how the panelists, especially you, I forgot your name.
John-Allan.
There you go. Approached interviewees, and just any other tips on my project that I'm trying to do.
I think the first thing is honesty, right? So be honest with what your intentions for the story are, where it could go, and also be honest with yourself about the fact that it's difficult to talk to these people because you'll run the risk of re-traumatizing them. So the process of getting them to talk, getting them to speak, has to be one where they acknowledge that there might be a risk of re-traumatization. But what I've found is when you treat each story with empathy, then it becomes more cathartic than it is, traumatizing for each of the people that we spoke to. Yeah.
Can I just, a little plug, on Saturday we have another gender panel which is called Their Story or Yours, and how to do less extractive journalism, and Mira, who's moderating it, is here, where we will be talking about this, right? When you are doing, whether it's gender-related or not, reporting on sensitive communities, marginalized voices, people who do not trust the media or are not usually exposed to them, you have your own objective and agenda as a journalist, and part of that overlaps with that of the victim or the character, but how do you do that work in a way that allows you to achieve both without being fully extractive, coming in, taking what you need as a journalist, and not really thinking about what happens to them. So please do join us, if you can, on Saturday for that session, because we're going to really be looking at that. All right, any more questions from the room? There's a hand at the back. Maybe we can come over to this side of the room first. Please do come this way first so that we can... There's always that thing when you're sat in the blind spot of the room. They're really not listening to me at this point. They're just like, la.
Thank you. I have a question for Ankur. I thought something that she said by the end was really interesting, which was that you made an editorial choice not to interview people that were in positions of power. And while I think it's, I agree with it and I respect it, I understand that it goes against what we usually learn in journalism schools, right? That we should always make sure that the story is balanced in terms of points of view. So how did you find that balance without having the voice of people that were accused of, perpetrating violence, basically?
Yeah, thanks for that question. And this is something we talk about a lot As Equals. I think the first, your primary responsibility is the safety of your source, and nothing really tops that. So you keep that in mind. The landlords who, where we felt that if we sort of name them, they could sort of harm the source. What we decided later is that probably better to interview higher authorities, so for example, housing societies which are making rules and standards, and so if they can create systems, then that would not allow landlords in some ways to indulge in such practices would be better than just targeting one or two landlords and then who can actually harm the community. So we were looking at who are the people at the top whom we can question and hold accountable for this kind of reporting, instead of just going to 2 or 3 specific people who were indulging in these practices.
The 2 people who had their hands up will take your questions together because we have 5 minutes left. So please do. There was one right in front of you here, sir, and then the other hand there. We'll take one and then the other and then close.
No. Hello? Oh, there it is. Okay, so my question is, a lot of these issues, for a lot of these issues, there are already nonprofits and organizations that are working on these populations and often on these and for a very long time, they've been in this sort of world. So I was just wondering how you communicate with them and how you also lifted up their stories and your stories, because I think there's really heroic efforts out there on many of these issues that are already happening, beyond just the victims, unfortunately, as well.
You haven't specified anyone, but maybe I'll ask you, Mia, since
Anybody.
you haven't come in yet. So have you been working with sex worker organizations? Do you highlight them in your work?
Yes, you're right. There are many organizations working. Of course, those are the organizations which help you to find case studies so that you highlight the voices of of their members. But in our case, something that we could offer them was they didn't always have budgets for good advocacy tools. And we had budgets to create really great graphics, for instance, with numbers of sex workers or myths about sex work or regulation points. And we gave it to them for free to use in their own advocacy campaigns, and that was appreciated. So it was a great talking together thing. And the public discussion forum, if you just host it, they really run it because they're in the audience. I don't think there's any way that you can tell a story like this without working closely with those organizations.
Again, a plug for the zine, because in there we have some tips on how we work with communities. I am really abusing my privileges, aren't I? There is that last hand at the back.
Yes, okay, so my name is Moki Makura, and I run an organization called Africa No Filter. So we think a lot about narrative change. So there are two things that struck me about the selection of stories. One, all from the Global South, all the women were all sort of from the Global South. And secondly, all of them seem to be presented as victims. So my question, and it's not to any particular person, is about the narrative. When we write these stories, these gender stories, what is the narrative? And do we care about the narrative that we put out? And the one ironic thing that struck me was that the series is called As Equals. So that's my question. Do we think about the narrative we put out about women when we do these stories?
I think that's a great question to end on, Moki, and that perhaps each of the speakers, through the vantage point of your own organizations and work, might have an answer to that. From an As Equals perspective, our work is to do, in part, a lot of investigative journalism. We want to take as seriously the things that happen disproportionately to women or gender diverse people as we take covering elections or, OSINT investigations into, we want to take those stories seriously. That means that you are focusing disproportionately on the harm that comes to women, and you're treating that as worthy of investigation, explanation, and humanizing. What we also then do is that we avoid what I would call development reporting, where the victim is a Black or brown woman and the hero in the story is an NGO from somewhere else. We always ask ourselves, what does agency look like, even for someone to whom harm is being done? So if you read or watch any of our stories and videos, you will find that yes, we are talking about harm coming to people, but we are talking about both their resilience and the ways in which they often organize themselves or, counteract that. Or as Ankur said, you are muddying the narrative, you're nuancing the story, so it's not just, oh, I'm a victim, but that actually here are my thoughts on what should happen in my life. I do think that a lot of our storytelling, because it's investigative in nature, is pointing out harms. But I think if you engage with our storytelling, you should be left with the sense that these women aren't just victims. And I think that there's something also quite patronizing in a sort of very binary sense of good story or bad story about people. There are bad things that happen to people, but even in those circumstances, they should have agency, they should be complex human beings and not just victims. And I think it's possible to do that even on stories of harm. Each of you, what are your concluding thoughts on that?
Yeah, I couldn't agree with what Eliza said more, and I share kind of this mission of, investigating patriarchy, and if you're investigating patriarchy in the form of a government that does not embed a gender analysis in its refugee policy, you have to show the harm. I will just say, I once went to a conference where they did a poll at the beginning saying, do you think women are A, helpless victims, or B, brave survivors? Vote now. And so I would just say that my reporting tries to be the opposite of that binary.
I think you said it all. If you read, what we did was basically a summary of our stories. Because like for me, the women, in spite of what they've dealt with, have moved on with their lives and have made meaning out of their lives. They've not wallowed in the miseries. But the idea of doing that story was to portray their lives as holistically as possible. So if you read the stories, you would see that it's not all about being a victim. They've been resilient and they've moved on.
I think when you look at femicide, you tend to think that there's no upside or there's no different narrative. But I think one of the most important things that this data set has done is that it's challenged false narratives that then tend to give succor and some sort of, you know, I don't know what the word is, but yeah, to give the people who permeate and perpetrate these narratives an opportunity to keep on doing that and repeating them when they are false. So when you have such a strong data set that tells the truth about a situation, then it's used as a tool for narrative change. I think the demonstrations, the protests that happened in Nairobi are testament to that, and that storytelling obviously becomes more nuanced in the ways that Eliza mentioned.
With sex work, it's really easy to portray people as victims, and it's so important not to do that. So the first thing we did was we reported on sex work as work, not as a vice, that it's a proper job. And many people choose to do that, regardless of what your reason is. It is a human rights issue, it is a job. The second thing was that when we put sex workers, for instance, in a room with powerful people, like a justice minister, we gave them equal agency. The justice minister had no more space to say his say than the sex workers, and there were people fighting for their rights. They weren't victims.
And lastly,
yeah, I just quickly say that I don't necessarily think of victim or hero narratives. What we want to do in our stories is just reflect the world of your sources as truly and as closely as possible, and the choices they are making constantly as they are telling their stories, which is what we did in case of, say, the bribing story. We are telling that these LGBTQ people are constantly making choices, the groups they are forming, how they are communicating to stay safe, and even in Bianca's stories, the choices she's constantly making to go to the doctor, taking the risk, coming back, telling her friends that you can go to the doctor. So we are not, these are not really victim narratives. We're explaining the choices that they are making and reflecting their world as closely as possible.
That's also such a really good point, that perhaps sometimes it reflects our own privilege and distance from their lives to say that if we're talking about sex workers, then it's victimizing, or if we're talking about trans women, then it's I think that's such an important reminder that we should also check ourselves, because their lives might seem harsh to us, but it's just their lives. All right, audiences, thank you so much for staying with us.